My daughter-in-law slid a folder across my kitchen table while she was closing a business deal. "We've talked it over," she said, not even looking up at me. "From now on, your Social Security and pension checks need to go directly into our account. We'll manage everything from there." My son sat next to her, staring at his coffee mug. I looked at the papers, direct deposit authorization forms, already filled out with their account number. They'd just left a blank line for my signature. I picked up my reading glasses, studied the forms for a moment, then set them down. "That makes sense," I said. "Let me think about the best way to handle the transition." My daughter-in-law smiled. My son finally looked up. Neither of them knew that I spent 31 years as a fraud investigator for the Federal Trade Commission. "My name is Douglas. I'm 67 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Knoxville, Tennessee, the same house I bought with my late wife, Patricia, in 1987. The roof needs work. The garden out back has gotten a little wild since Patricia passed 4 years ago, but it's mine, paid off, and I know every creak and every floorboard. My son is 34. I'll call him my son throughout this, because that's what he is, even after everything. His wife, I'll call her my daughter-in-law, is 32. They've been married 6 years. They live about 20 minutes from me in a rental house they've been in since before the wedding. For the first 2 years after Patricia died, my son called every Sunday. He'd come by for dinner once or twice a month. I thought we were close. I thought grief had brought us together in a way we hadn't been when he was younger and too busy to sit still. I was wrong about a lot of things. It started small. A request to borrow $300 for a car repair. I gave it without hesitation. Then $600 for a dental bill. Then $1,200 because they were short on rent. Each time I said yes. Each time I told myself this is what fathers do. What I didn't realize, what took me an embarrassingly long time to see, was that nothing was ever paid back, not $1. And the requests were coming closer together. Patricia always said I was too trusting with people I loved. She said it was my one real professional blind spot. "You can smell a con from a stranger a mile away," she used to tell me, "but you hand your wallet to family without blinking." She wasn't wrong. By the time my son and daughter-in-law sat down at my kitchen table with those forms, they had borrowed, if you can call it that, just over $9,000 from me over 18 months. I had kept a record in a small notebook, not because I planned to do anything with it. I just kept records out of habit. 31 years of habit. The direct deposit idea wasn't the first sign something had shifted. It was just the most brazen. A few months before that kitchen table moment, I had started noticing things. My electric bill, which I pay automatically, suddenly appeared on a statement from a different address. My son's rental address. Someone had called the utility company and requested a billing address change. I didn't authorize that. Then, my Medicare supplemental insurance. I received a letter thanking me for updating my contact information. I had not updated anything. Then, and this is the one that made me put down my coffee and sit very still for a long time, I checked my online bank account one morning and saw an ATM withdrawal for $400 from a branch across town. I had not left my neighborhood that week. My knees have been bad since the fall before last, and I don't drive to that side of town anymore. I went back through 3 months of statements, 7 ATM withdrawals at locations I had never visited, smaller amounts, 80 here, 120 there, scattered between larger ones. Whoever was doing it was smart enough to stay under the amounts that trigger automatic bank alerts, but not smart enough to account for a retired FTC investigator who reads his statements line by line. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I sat on that knowledge for 3 weeks before I did anything. I want to be honest about those 3 weeks, because I think people expect that when you discover your own child is stealing from you, you immediately pick up the phone and take action. That's not how it works, or at least it wasn't how it worked for me. I sat with it. I walked around my yard in the evenings and argued with myself. I told myself there must be an explanation. I told myself maybe my memory was going. Maybe I had made those withdrawals and forgotten. I'm 67, not 107, but grief does things to your mind, and there were some dark months in that first year after Patricia that I'm not entirely proud of. But I checked the ATM camera inquiry that my bank provided when I called to ask about suspicious activity I may have forgotten. The person at my account on those dates was not me. I did not tell my son. Instead, I started doing what I did for 3 decades. I documented everything. I printed statements. I made notes with timestamps. I contacted my bank's fraud department quietly and explained the situation. They were helpful and discreet. I asked them not to close the accounts yet. I needed a little more time. 2 weeks later, my daughter-in-law called to tell me they were worried about my ability to manage my finances on my own. She said it gently, the way people say things they've rehearsed. She mentioned that a lot of seniors find it helpful to have family support with money management. She mentioned almost in passing that they would love to help me avoid any financial stress. I said, "That's so thoughtful. Let's talk more about it when you come over." They came over on a Thursday evening with that folder. Here's what I want to say about that moment. I was not angry. I know that surprises people when I tell this story. But I had spent 2 weeks preparing, and when you prepare that thoroughly, the anger has somewhere to go. It goes into the preparation. By the time they sat down at my table, I was very, very calm. I told them I needed a few days to think about the direct deposit change. I said I wanted to make sure the transition didn't mess up any automatic payments. My daughter-in-law nodded patiently. My son said, "Of course, Dad, no rush." He patted my hand. The next morning, I drove to my bank and closed the account. I opened 2 new accounts at a different bank entirely. I set up all my direct deposits. Social Security, pension, a small annuity Patricia had left to go into the new accounts. I changed every password on every financial account I had, including utilities, insurance, everything. I called the utility company and corrected my billing address. I called my Medicare supplement provider and put a verbal password on any future account changes. Then I drove to the Knox County Sheriff's Office. I want to tell this part carefully, because I know some people reading this will think, that's your own child. Why would you go to the police? And I understand that. I sat in the parking lot of that sheriff's office for 20 minutes before I went inside. I thought about Patricia. I thought about who my son was at 7 years old, at 12, at 19 when he called me from a college dorm at 2 in the morning because he was scared about his future. But I also thought about the $400 ATM withdrawal, and the billing address change, and the $9,000 in loans, and the folder with my signature line already printed. I went inside. The detective I spoke with was thorough and kind. I brought my printed statements, my notebook, my timeline. She said it was one of the most organized cases of elder financial fraud she had received from a victim. I told her I used to investigate fraud for a living. She smiled a little at that. She told me that what my son had done, accessing my account without authorization, redirecting my billing information, constituted financial elder abuse under Tennessee law. The ATM withdrawals alone, she said, were potentially felony theft depending on the total amount and intent. I gave them everything they needed. My son was arrested on a Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks after I filed the report. He called me from the police station. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message twice. He sounded scared and young, the way he had on that phone call from the dorm. That was the hardest moment. I won't pretend it wasn't. My daughter-in-law called an hour later. Her voice was different, not scared, just flat and controlled. She told me I was making a terrible mistake. She told me I was going to destroy the family. She told me I was going to destroy the family. She told me Patricia would be ashamed of me. I let that one go to voicemail too. I want to say something about the Patricia comment because I've thought about it a lot. Patricia would not have been ashamed of me. Patricia would have found those ATM withdrawals herself 6 months earlier, called our son directly, and given him exactly 48 hours to confess and make a plan before she made the same drive to the sheriff's office. She was more decisive than me. She always was. I like to think I finally caught up. The legal process took several months. I won't go through every detail because honestly, some of it was tedious in the way legal processes are, forms and hearings and phone calls from the public defender's office. What matters is the outcome. My son pled guilty to 1 count of financial exploitation of an elderly or vulnerable adult, a Class D felony in Tennessee. He was sentenced to probation, mandatory financial counseling, and ordered to pay restitution in full, the ATM withdrawals plus documented losses totaling just over $11,000. His name and the nature of the conviction are public record. My daughter-in-law was not charged. The detective explained that the evidence of her direct involvement was circumstantial. She had been the one to make the utility address change, but proving she did it without my authorization to a criminal standard was more difficult. This bothered me, and I'll be honest about that. Those authorization forms at my kitchen table didn't fill themselves out, but I accepted what the legal system could do and moved forward. Something else happened during those months that I didn't expect. My son's employer, he works in financial services, handles accounts for a mid-sized investment company, was notified of the conviction as part of the standard background recheck that his company does following any criminal record update. He lost his job. I did not arrange that. I did not call anyone. It happened because that's how those jobs work, and my son understood when he took that job that a criminal conviction in this category would be incompatible with his license. I tell people that not to be cruel. I tell people that because when you ask me if I regret what I did, I want you to understand the full picture of consequences. I did not set out to end his career. I set out to stop the theft and protect myself. The career consequence came from his choices, not mine. Here is the part that I've turned over in my mind more than any other part. About 2 months after sentencing, my son came to my house alone. No lawyer, no wife, no phone call ahead of time. He knocked on the front door on a Saturday afternoon in March. I saw him through the window and I stood there for a long moment deciding whether to open it. I opened it. We sat on the back porch, the one that looks out over Patricia's garden, which I had finally started tending again that spring. He didn't say anything for a while. I didn't either. The garden needed the silence, I think. He told me he was sorry. He didn't explain or justify. He said he knew there was no explanation that would make it right. He said his wife had convinced him over a period of about a year that I was declining, that I wasn't going to be able to manage my own finances much longer, that they were actually helping me by getting ahead of it. He said he knew even then that he was lying to himself, that it was easier to believe a story than to admit he was taking from his father. He cried. I didn't. I told him I heard him. I told him I didn't know yet what our relationship would look like going forward. I told him I loved him the way I had always loved him, but that love didn't mean I would pretend the last 2 years hadn't happened. He nodded. He asked about the garden. I told him the tomatoes were coming in late because of the cold April we'd had. He left after about an hour. I don't know what the future looks like for us. I'm not one of those people who has a neat answer to that question. Some days I think we'll find our way back to something. Other days I'm not sure there's a back to go to. Maybe it would have to be something entirely new, built on what's left after everything burned. I changed my will in January. Not to punish him, or not only for that reason, because I needed to make decisions based on reality, and reality had changed. I worked with an elder law attorney here in Knoxville, one that a friend from church recommended. She was patient with me and thorough. My estate is now structured in a way that requires independent trustee oversight of any distribution. No one person in my family can access anything without accountability to a third party. The attorney told me she sees families like mine more often than I would imagine. That made me feel something I didn't expect to feel. Not better exactly, but less alone. Because for a long time, I had the private shame of it. The feeling that I had somehow created this situation. That a better father would have seen it coming. That a stronger man wouldn't have handed over $300 the first time without asking more questions. I carried that shame quietly for the better part of a year. I don't carry it the same way now. What happened to me happens to roughly 1 in 10 older Americans, according to the National Council on Aging. Most of it goes unreported because the people doing it are family, because the victim doesn't want to believe it, because the victim is afraid of being alone, of losing the relationship entirely, of being seen as someone whose own child turned against them. I understand all those reasons. I lived in them for months. But here's what I know now. At 67, sitting on this back porch with coffee and a garden that's finally coming back, the moment I stopped accepting what was happening was the moment I started respecting myself again. And respecting myself. That's the only way I know how to love anyone properly, including my son. Patricia knew that. She tried to tell me. I just needed to learn it the hard way. If you're watching this and something in my story sounds familiar, a billing change you didn't authorize, a request that doesn't quite add up, a feeling in your gut that you keep talking yourself out of, please listen to that feeling. You are not being paranoid. You are not being disloyal. You are being a person who deserves to be safe in their own home, in their own finances, in their own life. Call your bank, print your statements, and if you need to, make the drive. I'll be here if you have questions. I read every comment, even when I don't always respond as fast as I'd like. Leave your thoughts below, and if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. There are more stories coming. I'll see you in the next one. I've had a lot of time to think about what caused all of this, not just what my son did, but how it was allowed to build the way it did. And the honest answer is that causes and effects in a family don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, the way water damage does behind a wall. By the time you see it, it's been going on for a long time. My son didn't wake up one morning and decide to steal from his father. That's what I've had to sit with. The decisions that brought him to my kitchen table with those forms were made gradually, over months, maybe years. Small choices that each felt manageable until they weren't. He chose to spend beyond what he earned. He chose to accept his wife's framing that I was declining. He chose not to call and ask me directly. Each of those choices had a consequence, and the consequences stacked. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth of how these things work. What I've come to believe, and I say this as someone who spent 3 decades watching people make catastrophically bad decisions for understandable reasons, is that integrity isn't a personality trait you're born with. It's a practice. It's what you do on the Tuesday afternoons when nobody is watching and you're tired, and it would be so much easier to take the shortcut. My son stopped practicing it little by little, and by the time he was sitting across from me, he had rationalized himself so far from who he actually was that he barely recognized it. That's the part that cost him the most, not the legal consequences, though those were real. Not the job, though losing it changed his life. The deepest cost was losing the version of himself he could have been. You can't get that back through a court order or a restitution payment. You get it back, if you get it back at all, through the same slow accumulation of small, honest choices that lost it in the first place. As for me, I learned something about what strength actually requires. For most of my life, I thought of myself as a strong person. I had a demanding career. I raised a son mostly on my own after Patricia got sick the first time. I handled hard things. But sitting in that sheriff's office parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, that was a different kind of heart. That required something I hadn't had to use before, which was the willingness to protect myself even when doing so came at a cost I would feel for the rest of my life. Resilience, I think, is not about being unaffected. It's about being affected completely and still doing the necessary thing. I was affected. I still am. My son and I are somewhere in the middle of a long, uncertain road, and I don't know where it ends. But I didn't let that uncertainty stop me from making the right call, and I don't regret it. If there is any wisdom I would pass forward from all of this, it's simply this. The moment you start making excuses for someone else's behavior toward you is the moment you owe yourself a harder, more honest look at the situation. Love is not the same as permissiveness. Loyalty is not the same as silence. And protecting yourself is not a betrayal of the people you love. It is the only foundation on which any real relationship can eventually be rebuilt. I'm still here, still tending the garden, still learning.